Hello everyone, we'll be starting now. Thank you all for joining in. And today's webinar from the FreeMind group is on non-dilutive funding for preclinical stage research. My name is Jonathan Adelist from the FreeMind group, and I will be giving today's talk. Few matters to get out of the way off the bat before we start. First of all, if you have any questions, feel free to type them into the questions section, and I'll try to address as many of them towards the end as I can. I will be sending out the slides to everybody who registered, so no worries about that. If you joined in today and are listening to me, obviously, then you will receive via email a copy of the deck. And besides that, let's get going. So, a few words about who we are and what we do. Well, the FreeMind Group is a consulting firm, and we help our clients raise funding from non-dilutive sources. We work across the life sciences. We've been around for about 18 years now. Currently, just about 60 full-time employees, and we work with pretty much anybody in the life sciences. Could be small companies all the way up to some of the largest ones out there, academic institutes, medical research centers, anything like that. So actually, this year we're expecting to submit a little bit more, but I'll say 500 applications a year at this point. And in terms of the importance or the role of non-dilutive funding in the market, this is based on a study from the Milken Institute from a few years ago. They looked into really the long-term value of raising money from this type of source. And they found that because of things like the seal of quality and the approval that you get beyond the fact that you can advance your research with this funding, the actual long-term value of every dollar raised, because this will also help you raise additional investments and things like that, is actually about $8.38 in the long run, and that's over the course of 8 years in the future. Now, obviously, $1 million is $1 million. I'm not saying it's not, but it's important to understand that there are some other and very important implications to receiving this type of funding. And this is, to be fair, not looking at local grants and things like that. This is the validation and the credit that comes with funding. NIH, the Department of Defense, major funders that are also competitive. But if you do receive that type of funding, that's real validation for your ideas beyond the funding itself. And an interesting statistic is that actually 50% of all FDA-approved drugs received government funding at some time during the course of their R&D. And that's a very powerful number. I mean, there is a little chicken and egg issue here where the two things can affect each other. So it's either the fact that you received that funding and it advanced you forward, allowed you to increase your chances to reach the finish line, but also you could say that the fact that you had fantastic science helped you A, receive this type of funding, and B, also get the FDA approval at the end of the day. And the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. So there is that type of effect here. But the bottom line, I think, and the take-home message is that once you do get your foot in the door, once you do have that type of validation, and you join this relatively more exclusive group of projects that have this type of funding, your statistics improve pretty significantly. In terms of the pocket of money, we're talking about currently about $50 billion a year. That's before the very recent NIH increase to the budget, so next year it'll probably be a little bit higher. And my PowerPoint just froze. I apologize. I'll bring that back up. There you go. I hope that doesn't happen again. But anyway, so essentially the pocket of money, as I mentioned, over $50 billion a year, and it's broken down into about a little bit over 32 from the NIH and the various institutes there, and then additional HHS organizations, BARDA, FDA, CDC, NSF. The DoD, as I mentioned earlier, does a lot of funding via either the military itself, DARPA, DTRA. The congressionally directed medical research programs are a fantastic resource as well. And then there are a lot of private foundations, and in that case it's very dependent on the specific indication, obviously. But really the point here is that there are a lot of different sources, and although many companies in our field tend to focus on NIH SBRs, and there's nothing wrong with that, but part of what I'm here to say today is that focusing just on that in many cases can be a mistake. Looking at the NIH budget, as I mentioned, 32.3 billion next year. It's looking to be increased probably to something in the vicinity of 34.5. Although there were threats that it would go pretty significantly in the other direction, we're all very pleased to say that that's not the case. And basically, of that budget, the vast majority, currently about 27 billion, is going out to external research. So this is a really significant pocket of money, and as I mentioned, there are various other ones, but the NIH is a huge source of funding. And the way that's broken down, this is an interesting way to look at it, to understand how wide the scope of what they would be willing to fund is. And this is maybe the first time I'm really touching on what really I think the most important thing to understand here is there is, with a fair degree of certainty, money out there for, in this case, what we're talking about today, preclinical research in almost any area of the life sciences. No matter what you do, what you're developing, there's probably a pretty significant amount of money that's out there that's relevant. There's a very long tail on this graph. Obviously, all the indications that are out there are not here. This is not actually per indication, it's per field, but still. The point is they fund pretty much everything. There are 27 different institutes in the NIH. Each one has their own focus, and each one covers a set of either indications or populations, but altogether they really cover pretty much everything. And the way they do that effectively, because obviously they can't have specific mechanisms directed to each and every single indication and each and every type of approach or type of solution. A very significant portion of the funds every year, last year was over 60%, but it does vary, goes out through what they call parent announcements or omnibus solicitations. There are various terms, but generally speaking, these are very broad, actually completely open mechanisms that have no scientific guidelines in terms of what the science should be. It has to be interesting to the institute you direct it to. So as an example, you do something in oncology, you direct it to the NCI. You do something in, let's say, kidney, so you direct it to the NIDDK. But so long as it is of interest to one of the institutes, you direct it to that institute. And then besides that, the only real determining factor in if you're relevant or not is the stage of development. And there are different mechanisms to accommodate that. So the R21 is for early stage exploratory work. They technically say that no preliminary data is required. We would very strongly suggest you do add preliminary data, to put it lightly. But the reason I say that is they fund very, very early work. High risk, high reward, very good idea. With not that much to back it up, is still something you may be able to well, obviously submit, but also get funding for this mechanism. Because we're talking about very early work, the budget cap is not very high, 275,000 plus the indirect costs. For a U.S. company, usually the indirect costs are something between 30 and 40% for a for-profit business. For non-U.S. companies, we're talking about something closer to 8%, but still, it's usually something between $300,000 and $350,000 regardless. This is over 2 years, and great mechanisms. The R01 is for later stage research, so more substantiated claims. Usually in the context of preclinical work, we're talking about, if you already have some data, you're moving into animal models, things like that, that would be the time to submit an R01. They will fund you for up to 5 years, and the budget cap is, well, actually, technically there's no budget cap, but we would very strongly suggest that if you're going to ask for more than $500,000 a year for that 5-year period, so up to over 2.5 million, you should definitely ask for pre-approval for that budget. If not, you can just submit it if it's within that scope. But obviously a much higher dollar amount here. Something important to mention about the R21 and the R1, there is a very common misconception that this is only for academics, and that is just simply not true. Beyond the fact that we have a lot of examples every year of companies that are awarded, I can say that it is definitely different to an SBIR. An SBIR is a business grant, and they focus on things like commercialization, and it's oriented towards businesses. R21s and R1s are for research. They're hypothesis-driven. You have to know how to present your project as such. That does not mean in any way, shape, or form that a company cannot apply. You just have to know how to present your ideas in the right way to make it compatible. And it's something, it's very possible we do it all the time. Additional mechanisms, obviously the SBIR and STTR mechanisms, and this is a portion of the funds that is set aside for small businesses by law. And we're talking about usually phase 1 and phase 2. Sometimes there are fast tracks, and we'll elaborate a little bit on that in a few minutes. But generally speaking, the phase 1 is usually up to $225,000, and phase 2 is usually up to $1.5 million, where that's actually already exceeding the standard. But you can basically, the hard cap is 150 for phase 1 and 1 million for a phase 2, but you can exceed that by 50%. So these are the actual numbers. And it's important to mention this is not plus indirect cost, this includes the indirect cost. So the total budget, including the indirect costs, should be up to these numbers. The CDMRPs, which I mentioned earlier, are also a very, very good set of programs for preclinical development. This is under the Department of Defense, which may be surprising when you first think of it. Why would the DoD fund things like, let's say, oncology? And it's a fair question. The answer, by the way, is the fact that they're not only charged with taking care of the men and women in uniform, but also veterans, families of the men and women in uniform. So they definitely do a lot of research in areas that you would not initially expect. But regardless of the reasoning, there are a lot of programs in various areas within the life sciences. This is money that Congress allocates once a year for a very large set of specific areas, but they're issued every year, and it's a once-a-year opportunity. Usually the way it works, they will announce the program typically towards the end of Q1 and the beginning of Q2 this year because of the the interesting occurrences that have been in the House. It took a little bit longer, and they're just starting to be announced now. A few were announced over the weekend, and we're looking forward to having pretty much everything else be announced in the next few weeks. But generally speaking, the way it usually works is they announce a pre-application date and a full application date. The pre-application is the major cutoff stage, so you can't actually submit a full application, obviously unless you submit a pre-application, but also unless you're asked to submit a full application. So in almost all the programs, the full application is upon invitation only. So the pre-application is typically a 2 to sometimes 5, even 10-page document, but generally a very short document. And although it's not a huge amount of work, it's something that's truly an art form. You have to do it very well and know how to construct it in the perfect way, because, as I mentioned, most of the applications do not progress beyond this stage. It's extremely competitive, even though it's a very short document. You have to really know how to convey what you want to within that short space. Hopefully your application, rather pre-application, is positively viewed, and you're asked to submit a full application, and then you submit the full application on the full application date. And this happens once a year, as I mentioned. So unlike the previous ones that are typically 3 times a year, so if you miss a deadline, there'll probably be a new one in the very near future, typically about 4 months in the future. In this case, you will have to wait an entire year. So it's very important to take advantage of them when they're issued and announced. Additionally, there are BAAs, broad agency announcements, and these are typically relatively broad and generic in their scope, although there are also some specific ones. And the point here is really sourcing ideas in a specific focus area of interest. So it's not going to be a specific type of solution or type of therapy, but so long as it's within this kind of general scope that they're currently interested in, they'll look at anything you have. So if there's a BAA that could be relevant to something you do, it's always something that's interesting, because basically, and this is a generalization, usually The budgets here are fairly large, although it definitely does vary by solicitation. We're talking about typically relatively high dollar amounts. A little bit more information on the SBIR and STTR. First of all, for the upcoming deadlines for both of these programs, and these are the numbers, the PA 16302 and PA 16303 for the STTR, and there's a phase 1 and a phase 2. There's also an option for fast track. There's no longer currently open an option for a direct to phase 2, which is too bad, but that's how it is at the moment. And generally the deadlines are April, September, and January 5th. The upcoming one is September 5th. So get going with your applications, because it's not very immediate, but it'll come around sooner than you think, as most deadlines do. I mentioned the budget and the time periods earlier, so I'll just move forward here. A little bit of additional information. First of all, and I touched on this, you can't exceed the suggested limits by up to 50% when you justify it, and it's fairly easy to justify, to be honest. If you can't justify it, then you probably shouldn't be submitting at all. Well, obviously justify in terms of the budget. You can submit a lower budget if you have convincing science. That's fine. But anyway, in terms of eligibility for the SBIR and STTR programs, we're talking about small businesses, and the SBA defines that as under 500 employees, and that are either majority owned by U.S. citizens or U.S. residents. So you don't have to necessarily be a citizen, but you have to reside in the United States if you're the majority owner of a company to be eligible for an SBIR. So as an example, if you have a non-U.S. company that has a U.S. subsidiary, depending on the ownership structure, usually that would not make that subsidiary SBIR eligible. In terms of the restrictions, depending on phase 1 or phase 2, you have to carry out either half or 2/3 of the work in-house. The guidelines are no virtual companies, but that's debatable because there are loopholes there. Basically, there are ways to outsource work and present it as work that they would count as done in-house. And there are a few examples of this, but let's say you outsource a set of activities to a CRO, you receive raw data from them, and you analyze it yourself. They consider that something that you carried out in-house. So we actually have been successful in helping virtual companies awarded SBIRs, but it's not always possible, so it is important to mention that that is technically the guideline. They look at your commercialization plan, which other grants will not look at, and generally speaking, the portion of, and this is by law, it's 3.65% of any government agency that funds over $100 million a year in R&D is devoted to SBIR and STTR programs, and that's the case here as well. So in terms of the deadlines for the R21 and the R01, the R21 is June 16th, the upcoming deadline, and both of them will have deadlines in June, October, and February. R21s are on the 16th, R01s are on the 5th of those months, and across the board, these are very widely applicable. Anything, as I mentioned earlier, that basically any of the institutes in the NIH would be interested in can be submitted through these mechanisms. And the numbers, as I mentioned, are, I didn't mention, PA 16161 and PA 16160. So I think the best way to really take a slightly more in-depth look, because obviously I won't go into all the different sources of funding. I tried to present the very broad ones that are almost always applicable. And what I'll do now to give you some context to that is give you some specific examples and take it from a few fictional companies' case studies that we created. And the point here is not to really give you details on the specific solicitations that are relevant for each one of these companies, but to emphasize that there are things out there for pretty much anyone. Beyond, obviously, the ones that I mentioned earlier, because they're so broad, they're typically relevant, but even beyond that, there are usually additional sources. So we'll start with the first one, which is a US-based company, 17 employees, raised $5 million in Series A, and they're developing a new broad-spectrum antibiotic, or rather a few novel broad-spectrum antibiotics for use in drug-resistant bacteria. They have tested it in vitro, validated in animal studies, and they're looking to initiate their ADME tox studies as part of their IND package. So, looking into what could be relevant for what they're interested in doing. So, first of all, SBARs and STTRs, maybe not so much actually, but probably more SBIR in this case. Obviously, could be relevant based on the phase of the research. I would probably suggest a fast track, but not necessarily depending on the specifics, but usually in this case, yes. An RO1 could be very relevant because of the higher budget. It could be very attractive. And these are solicitations that I mentioned earlier. But an additional source of funding that could be relevant in this case is a BAA from USAMRIC, which is the United States Army Medical Research and Materials Command. Their BAA is currently open until September 30th, but it's issued every year October 1st. It's pretty much continuously open year-round, just depending on the fiscal year. So October 1st of this year, they'll issue the same one for 2018, and you can submit through that one as well. Sometimes they make minor changes to the focus areas, obviously, but generally speaking, because the focus areas are relatively broad, they have a lot of different focus areas, it covers a lot of research regardless. In this case, they have a lot of interest in both infections in wounds and biofilm formation, which are both relevant to what this company does. And if this is interesting to you or maybe close to what you are looking to fund, go ahead and look for it. The number here, the W81XWH17RBAA1, should lead you very easily on Google to finding the full document with all their focus areas. Regardless, there's no budget cap here and no deadlines, so pretty much anything that's within scope of what they're looking for can be submitted at any time. This also works on a pre-app, full app model, but there are just no specific deadlines. So whenever you submit the pre-app, they'll review it and ask you for a full app. So they won't wait for the solicitation to close September 30th to start reviewing the applications. If you submit today, it will be reviewed soon, and if you submit towards the end of the cycle, it will be reviewed then. So the sooner you submit, the better. And honestly, this is a type of mechanism we in our kind of long-term strategy that we employ rather with our clients, we typically use this type of mechanism that has no deadlines to fill in the gaps between the other deadlines, and that really allows us to maximize the efficiency and submit as many applications as possible. Another source of funding that could be relevant is the MIDRP under the CDMRPs, and that's the Military Infectious Disease Research Program. This is one of the ones that hasn't been issued yet for this year, but it is in the pre-announcements for this year, so it's going to be issued very soon. And based on last year, you could probably expect a budget cap of about $2 million on this one. Because it hasn't been issued yet, that's all I really can say about this source at this point. But keep your attention towards this if it's relevant, because it should be issued very soon. Another source of funding that's very relevant is CARB-X. CARB-X is a private-public partnership kind of accelerator that was created by, well, a lot of different collaborators, but primarily NIAID, BARDA, Wellcome Trust, Boston University, and various other partners. And basically, they take companies under their wing that are in this field of antibiotic-resistant bacteria, and they really move them forward aggressively. So the funding is pretty significant. The first award, it's not exactly awardees, but it's powered by CARB-X companies, were announced just over a month ago, and basically we're expecting another call very soon. There have been already 2 deadlines, and the third one is probably going to be announced soon. And this is a fantastic program. If you're anywhere within the antibiotic resistance field, take some time and take a look at CARB-X. It's well worth it. Also, the Wellcome Trust. They have a translation fund that could be relevant for this stage of development. They cover a lot of areas, and again, it's something you should really look into to define whether or not this is something that could be relevant for you. But generally speaking, the budget, the area of research, there are no specific deadlines here as well, but also the budget has no specific cap. It really depends on a lot of the specifics. So you should just go ahead and take a look at that and find your answers with regards to whether or not this could be relevant for you. But in this case, it wasn't for the sake of the example. And these, they're not obviously all the relevant sources of funding. What we will typically do when we start really looking at the landscape for a client is get a much more in-depth understanding than just kind of the few sentences that I presented here, and speak with program officers in the various different agencies. And based on that, we can create a much more elaborate and specific strategy. But this is kind of a general overview of sources that are typically relevant in this field. So the second case study is in the oncology area of research, and basically this is a small U.S. company, 3 co-founders that are also the 3 employees. They invested in themselves, raised about $1 million from friends and family, and this is an immunotherapy approach for breast cancer. So they've developed and engineered the CAR T cells, and they're looking to initiate the in vivo studies in the future, and they're looking for funding for that. So the real standard source for something like this is obviously the NCI. The NCI is the largest institute within the NIH, about $6 billion, probably going to be increased next year, and they fund a lot of oncology research, as obviously would come from the fact that they have that size of a budget. And this is one of the institutes that most heavily relies on the parent R01. Every year, most of their money goes out through this mechanism. Most of the funding every single year goes out through this mechanism that has absolutely no restrictions or guidelines in terms of what type of science you should submit to them. Anything that's oncology related, obviously, because we're talking about the NCI, would be reviewed, and if they like it, you have a good chance of being awarded. So obviously that mechanism is first and foremost here. Also, for this stage of development, probably a fast-track SBAR, also to the NCI, would be relevant. And that, as I mentioned earlier, is $225,000 for the phase 1 and about up to 1.5 million for the phase 2. And I failed to mention that the R01 has, well, I mentioned it earlier, but not on this slide, no budget cap, but we would suggest pre-approval for asking for more than 2.5 million. Also, metabolic reprogramming to improve immunotherapy. It's an R01 with standard due dates. So the next one would be June 5th, so that's coming up pretty soon. And standard budget, so again, don't ask for more than 2.5 million without making sure it's okay. And then this is something that was actually issued from the STEAM RPs just a few days ago, the breast cancer research program. Their stage of development is probably compatible with the level 2. The way it's typically broken down is there are, well, not typically, always, there are 4 levels of funding with the breast cancer research program. Levels 1 and 2 have their set of deadlines, and levels 3 and 4 have their set of deadlines. And basically, level 1 is something that's very, very early. Again, technically no preliminary data required. We would suggest submitting preliminary data. Level 2 is slightly more advanced work, but still, I guess maybe the best way to define it is by defining level 3, and then you'll see anything between what I mentioned earlier and level 3 will fall within level 2. Level 3 is anything that can realistically expect to move into the clinic within the near future. So we're talking about IND-enabling studies, things that are close to the clinic, then you can probably submit a level 3. If you're not quite there yet, then it would be a level 2. The budget cap for level 2 is about $750,000. The budget cap for level 3, though, is about $4 million. And then there's also a level 4, which is up to $10 million. But that's only for clinical trials, and that's not what we're discussing today. An additional source, oh, by the way, the deadlines for the level 2 are July 9th and 15th. 9th would be for the pre-application, 15th would be for the full application. And this is actually the exception I referred to earlier when I said that almost all of them have their major cutoff at the pre-application stage. This one, the pre-application, is not a cutoff stage at all. You have to submit a pre-application, but it's not, there's no selection based on the pre-application, and everybody can submit a full application. But this is one of the only CDMRPs that works this way. This is true for the levels 1 and 2. And then there's also the Breast Cancer Research Foundation, and they have no specific deadlines. They're interested in various different angles, obviously with breast cancer. And usually their awards are about $250,000, so much smaller in scope, but generally speaking, definitely worth approaching if it's compatible with your stage of development. And still, $250,000 is nothing to shake a stick at. And that really is the landscape for this company. And again, these are the kind of standard examples, not the examples that come into play upon in-depth analysis. The third example is a company, and it's obviously are fictional companies, but it's a U.S. company with 6 employees, spun out of an Ivy League university, raised about $2 million from various local grants, and they're developing a small molecule drug to treat ALS, which is very timely actually because, as you probably know, the first drug in a very long time that treats ALS was just approved by the FDA, and that's obviously fantastic. The place they are in terms of their development is they have identified their lead compound and validated in vitro, and they're looking to start the in vivo studies to determine efficacy, PK/PD, metabolism, toxicity, all of that, and pretty much as part of their IND enabling studies. So, and there really is a lot that could be relevant in this case. So first of all of the broad kind of parent announcements that we mentioned earlier, all of them could be relevant here. SBRs and STTRs, R21s and R01s, really depending on the angle and the scope of the research they're looking to fund. It's kind of on the border between the two, so really depending on how you package it and present it, it could go either way, and it really was more about strategy and understanding from the program officers what the best way to go would be in this case, but both of them are technically possible. And I've mentioned the budgets and the deadlines already, so I'm going to skip that. And then there are a lot, in this case, there are a lot of NINDS, which is the National Institute for Neurological Disorders and Stroke. There are a lot of NINDS grants that could be relevant for them as well, specific calls for applications. And by the way, as I mentioned a few times, when you don't find a specific call for applications that's very well aligned with what you do, like in this case there are a few, that really doesn't mean that your chances are any lower to receive funding. And I hope that's been something that I've been able to emphasize. Just use the parent announcements. But anyway, so there's the IGNITE program that's designed for very early stage research, and kind of essentially they found a gap in what they fund towards their CREATE and BPN programs, depending on if it's a small molecule or a device or a biologic, dictate which one of those slightly more advanced programs you move into. But the IGNITE is something that they issued to cover that gap and fund kind of the very early stage research and segue it into the slightly later stage development. So it's an R21, R33, which is a phased program. It's not an SBAR, so it's not phase 1 and phase 2, but there are 2 phases to this. But it's more similar to a fast track than the phase 1 and the phase 2, because the only way to submit this is to submit one application for both, and either you're awarded on both the R21 and R33 or you're not. And basically when you reach the milestones for the R21, you start receiving the R33 funding. Generally speaking, the total costs, the total value of both the phase 1, of the R21 phase and the R33 phase are typically, it does depend how you construct it, because the timing can be different. Sometimes out of the total 3 years you can have 1 year R21 and 2 years R33, or you can play around with that. But generally speaking, the maximum is about $750,000, and the deadline is June 16th. Great mechanism for early stage research, and I think you've been noticing that the earlier stage research mechanisms tend to have lower dollar amounts attached with them, and that makes sense. Basically, first of all, earlier stage research costs less, And second, you have less preliminary data to validate what you want to do and basically prove that this is really a good idea, and therefore they want to risk less money. If you can bring in a lot more data and say, okay, we believe it's going to work because of A and B, and we did this and we did that, and all of the results have been very encouraging, then you can submit something that's a bit more advanced, and then they will hopefully put in more money. So that's kind of a general rule of thumb. And then the slightly more advanced mechanism that also does fund preclinical and even sometimes early clinical work is the BPN U44. And this is also phased. This is actually a collaborative SBIR. So basically the way this works, there's a phase 1 and a phase 2. The phase 1 is about 400,000 and the phase 2 is 4 million. So it's much higher dollar amount than your standard SBIR. Deadline is October 11th, and this is specifically for small molecules. So that's what's relevant in this case. But they have other programs for biologics, for devices, things like that. CREATE program as an example. Another mechanism here, and I think we're going a bit long here, but so I'll touch on the next ones a bit more briefly. But generally speaking, opportunities for collaborative research at the NIH Clinical Center. That's working at the NIH Clinical Center, but you also receive funding up to 2.5 million here over 5 years of research. Could be relevant. NeuroNext is a little different. You know what? I'm going to skip that because it's not actually a grant. It's more access to infrastructure and data and resources, which is great. It can be fantastic, but it's not necessarily what we're really focusing on here today. The ALS CDMRP was issued as well just over the last weekend, so another CDMRP that is relevant specifically in this area. And as I mentioned, there are a lot of different areas. Take a look at the CDMRP website at their pre-announcements if you want to have the full list of everything that is expected to be announced. It's a very long list. And also the ALS Association definitely funds activities in ALS and could be a relevant source of funding here. So really, I hope I've been able to demonstrate that regardless of the area of research, there will be various different sources of funding that could be relevant for you. There are always the parent announcements, be it the SBAR and STTR, the R21, the R01. Then on top of that, there are sources like the CDMRP programs that cover a very wide area of research, not quite as open as the parent announcements, but very, very wide, and a lot of different indications fall into what they're interested in. And then depending on the area, various additional sources. So really looking at this as kind of a landscape that you have to navigate and find the right sources for what you do is the best way to approach it, because at the end of the day, there's nothing wrong with submitting one application, waiting around and hoping you'll be awarded, but that's not the best way to maximize your chances of an award. And I want to talk a little bit about how these applications are reviewed. Essentially, this is based on the NIH criteria, but I think it's a fair representation of how most applications are reviewed. There are 5 criteria: leadership, environment, significance, innovation, and scientific approach. And the answer to the question, do you have the right leadership? Do you have the proper environment? Is it significant? Is there real innovation here? The answer to all those questions definitely has to be yes, but what the determining factor will be in what applications are awarded is a top-notch scientific approach. And the way they look at it really is kind of weighing the risks against the strength. And it's kind of a risk assessment process where you have to be both responsive to what they're looking for, what they're interested in, what the current trends are. You have to present it in the right way to adhere to those things. And you also have to be competitive in terms of how your solution, your ideas compare to other solutions that are out there. And that's basically the things that should guide you in constructing. Understanding how it will be looked at is an important factor in our experience in producing applications that are eventually awarded. And our approach in general is to turn non-dilutive funding into a strategic source of funding for a company. So, but in no way am I advocating you should neglect public market, angels, VCs, anything like that. But I'll take the opposite approach and say, while definitely not neglecting those things, I think it's fair to say that neglecting non-dilutive funding is a mistake in almost all cases. The number I mentioned earlier, over $50 billion a year in funding, it's an interesting way to look at it, but if you do compare that pocket of money to the entire VC community and what they invest annually, more money goes into research from non-dilutive sources than from VCs every year. So think about that when you decide if this is something that's interesting to you, or if you want to overlook it. And the way to really maximize your chances of award is, first of all, seek into the interests and goals of the funding agencies. You have to speak with them. It's not impossible to receive an award if the first time they learn of your application is when you submit it, but that's probably not how I would suggest doing it. You have to correlate the strategy with your long-term R&D plan. There's no reason to, I mean, you know, you're not academics. Maybe some of you are, but the general assumption here is that most of the audience is not academics, and you don't conduct research just because you can get a grant for it. You conduct research that you want to conduct, that is aligned with what you want to accomplish, with your business plan, with what your board wants. So you do have to correlate your granting strategy with your actual long-term R&D plan. That being said, it's something that if you do truly understand the landscape, that definitely can be done. You identify all the relevant funding opportunities, and you plan and execute on a long-term multi-submission strategy. That is truly the only way to take this source of funding and make it something that is really a strategic source of funding. The only way to make it something that produces results on a, obviously not always, but on a relatively reliable level, is to take this type of long-term approach of a lot of different submissions to various different sources, resubmitting sometimes when you get a good review but it's not quite good enough, or in general when the comments are addressable, not necessarily because the score was very close. Sometimes you get a very low score or not discussed, but because you can address the comments, that resubmission would have better chances of being awarded than something that got a very marginal score, but it's very hard to address the reviewer's comments. So really read in more to the actual comments of the reviewers than the actual score when you're thinking of resubmitting. But anyway, you have to know your weaknesses. You have to address them. The fact that you know what possible problems with what you're proposing to carry out will be, and you address them, and you have plans in terms of how to address possible pitfalls, that's something that they would view as a real strength, because we all know science is not something you can really know how the results will turn out in, and the fact that you're prepared for that is something that will go a long way. Yeah, find the right partners if necessary. Collaborate if you have a gap in your capabilities. As I mentioned, you have to understand what they're looking for, and in general, the goal here is to produce a cohesive, coherent application that covers all the facets and really presents your ideas in the best possible way and maximizes how that aligns with what they're looking for. In terms of our team, so as I mentioned, 60 full-time employees, advisors, strategists, managers, writers, and basically the way we approach this with our clients is identify, as I mentioned, all the relevant funding opportunities. We create that type of a multi-submission granting strategy that I mentioned earlier, and we also try to produce as many applications as possible based on that strategy. And the strategy is something that's always being revised based on new solicitations that come out. But in general, that's our approach, and that's how we really make this a reliable source of funding for our clients. That's been our webinar for today. I hope it has been helpful to at least some of you. And I will currently take a look at some of the questions and see if we can find something interesting that's relevant for everyone. I'm happy to address questions that are a bit more specific via email, but if there are questions here that could be interesting to everyone, then I'm happy to address them now. So I have a question here about what I meant by later stage research in an R01. Basically, the point is anything that's not very early. An R01 would not be a good source of funding for, I don't know, hit to lead, screening, anything, usually even in vitro is probably too early for an R01. You have to come to them with a data package that really says, okay, we've done a lot of work here. We're looking to do a lot of additional work, but this is the reason why we believe this is a good idea, based on facts and data. Another question I got here is okay, so this is actually a few different questions on the same subject I see here. One is non-US, one is European company. Specifically, is the specific BA? Okay, I'll cover everything. Basically, in terms of eligibility for non-US entities, anything that I mentioned is an SBIR, so obviously the SBIR and STTR, but also the U44. Let me go back and show you exactly what I'm talking about. So here we go. The BPN U44 is not open to non-US companies. The SBIR and STTR here are not open to non-US companies. Here, the SBIR is not open to non-US companies. The rest is open. In general, pretty much everything I've added here is open to non-US companies, besides the SBIR programs that are not. So across the board, definitely the BAA, CDMRPs, those programs, the parent R01, pretty much all of them are open to any company. It's not a geographic issue. It's about the science. This is not relevant here, but just a point to mention, if you're talking about funding clinical trials, most of the relevant sources wouldn't care where the research is carried out, and they wouldn't care where the company is based. They would care if you have an IND and if you're going for regulatory approval in the United States, they'll fund it. Well, they'll consider funding it. If you're not, that may be an issue for clinical trials, but that's not relevant here. It's just something it's important to understand. Let me just see here if there are any broader questions here that I can address as well. There are a few other questions, but they're very specific. And anybody who would like to discuss in a bit more depth what could be relevant for their organization, shoot me an email. This is my contact information, Jonathan@FreeMindConsultants.com. Happy to discuss with anybody what would be relevant for their organization and their research plans. This is my phone number as well if you want to call me up. This has been recorded and will be uploaded as usual to our YouTube channel. And in general, I hope to meet you again at our upcoming webinars. Thank you all for joining, and I hope you enjoyed and at least learned something. Thank you.